So today we're talking about discrimination, not as in discernment of qualities, but as in the lumping together stereotypical prejudices. So discrimination as prejudice in action, right? So what brought this up? I think it's fairly obvious that at least one of the candidates for president is acting in a pretty discriminatory way. His rants against women and Muslims especially, and Mexican immigrants, all that sort of stuff. We've got to stop the Muslims coming in completely. When you have someone like that touting prejudice and talking about discriminating against whole blocks of people just because they are a member of what he sees as a block of people and that they're all the same, that's where discrimination is. So I'm kind of interested to hear from listeners if they've ever been discriminated against, or
if they're brave enough, have they ever discriminated somebody?
Have you ever acted on your prejudice and actually caused an action to happen whereby someone did not get what they wanted simply because of your prejudice, or
it could be just fear,
Fear. Where does it come from? Where does discrimination come from?
Yeah. I mean, just the thing of do you have a visceral, and most people wouldn't admit it, but, growing up the way that I grew up, that I was taught as a young woman, if you were on a street by yourself in the evening and you saw a black man coming towards you, that was supposed to be far more threatening than a white man coming towards you. That was just instilled in the culture. So I confess that I still have that little in the back of my head. I feel slightly more threatened if I'm in an environment where I already feel slightly out of my element. That, those are things, they're prejudices that we don't often want to admit that we do have, but we do.
I think that even before we're taught, and we're clearly taught, all our families, our cultures teach us, and I think it's necessary that they teach us a level of discrimination. But even before that, I've seen studies, and I can't quote them here right now, but taking young babies and showing them pictures of people, and the more the picture looks like the family or the caregivers of that baby, the more likely that baby is to trust, and the more different they look in terms of a different human being's face or whatever. So there's something innate in how our evolution has taken place that allows us to discriminate. And I don't want to argue that discrimination is part of what we do as humans, and it's necessary. So in the original definition of discrimination, we want that. We learn that. We can't. But then
you mean discrimination as discerning and discriminating between one thing and another.
Exactly. I mean, that's how we've survived. That's how I think all I think that's innate to mammals, that to discriminate who are they going to trust as another
and who's
animal.
The outsider? Keeping the tribe, having your loyalty, which I think is part of the problem in our political system now, is we've become so sort of reptilian brain function tribal that the other, because with the tribe, the other is a threat. So something that's the other, and that's where I read a really interesting article about how we really got to this point we did politically, where they started kind of even before Karl Rove, dividing up voters by smaller and smaller blocks, and not thinking of the Democratic Party represents this national wave of feeling and the Republican Party represents this. They have these little tiny voting blocks and things. Right. So they're pitting them. They can pit them against each other, pull them apart, stack them together.
Elections themselves are us discriminating. It's us making choices about whom we want to put in leadership positions and depend on. I think bad judgment, bad discrimination is what we're talking about. In other words, when you overgeneralize to the detriment of both your own understanding of what's going on and to how that other person is treated, especially with relationship to the law. So when we put the law into effect, then people can severely get hurt by these things that are actually quite natural being translated into a racist society acting to continue to keep blacks at a lower status,
As we did with segregation in the Deep Right. South. Right. Well, it was very interesting to me when my son was about 7 years old. We had gone back home for a wedding, and I'm originally from the Gulf Coast. So Luis was being raised, going to school in San Francisco. His father's Nicaraguan. He's in a very diverse culture in San Francisco, and so, but he knew about discrimination and that there had been bad things that had happened. He knew about slavery. He'd been being taught, or I'd been teaching him things that people have done and how things happen. So we were driving up the Natchez Trace, which is a little bit from New Orleans and then up through Mississippi.
Is that a highway?
It's a beautiful old road that mostly goes through state and national parks. It follows an old Indian game trail.
Right.
So we pull into this funky little gas station to get something to drink and go to the bathroom. And Luis comes running out to me, and he's like, Mommy, you got to come see what's in the bathroom. And I thought, oh, gosh, there's like a condom dispenser or something, or, And I said, what? And he goes, come. And he takes my hand, and there's up on the wall, there's writing with the N-word and some other racist kinds of not nice things. Mm-hmm. And I said, honey, we've talked about this. This is what I was talking about people being prejudiced. He goes, yeah, but they're over my head. I said, what do you mean? He said, Mommy, they're way high up on the wall. That meant a grown-up wrote that. Yeah. He thought that when I taught him about discrimination, that it was something that small children who hadn't been educated did, and that anybody who had become a grown-up would not ever be that stupid. Right. So he was blown away that it was written on the wall up above his head that grown-ups did that. And to be frank, it made him nervous the rest of the trip, because he said, will people be prejudiced of me because I'm part Nicaraguan? And I said, well, because you're very fair-skinned. But if you had...
Right. If anyone knew, yes.
When I would go back home with his dad, when we were married, and Lou is very, very, very dark-skinned, we'd be walking in the mall, and people would stick their heads out of stores and stare at us. And there was still that thing of, interracial couples being shocking.
And that's the cultural thing. That's what people are taught down there. I mean, it's been going on ever since white folks came here and had slaves. And
but it's my black friends will say it's worse to them in California because it's all hidden underneath.
Hidden discrimination.
It's hidden discrimination.
Hidden prejudice.
And I remember when I first moved here and I was working in the city, and I was like, why aren't there any black people here? I was like, I didn't see anybody of color, down in the financial district. And so that was strange to me as well, how it's out here very segregated where people are. It's not that diverse mix.
Here we're more likely to know people of greater diversity. And I think that's actually the antidote to most racism. I mean, most racisms and these kinds of discrimination we see in our society are because we really don't understand that other party or what they're going through or their life. We have some story we tell ourselves about them, but it's not true. And once we get to know a gay person, once we get to know a black person or a Hispanic person, and we start seeing the similarities with us, some of that breaks down. Sure. But it doesn't break down just because of politics or being told to. I think it comes from us actually interacting as a species.
Well, that was interesting, that kid that shut up the church, the black church.
Oh, my God,
and
what a story.
he was in there doing Bible class with them, and he said, I almost didn't shoot him because I kind of liked them.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, it is too bad that he couldn't have been there just a little bit longer to feel like how close he was to them.
Exactly.
Well, and it's interesting because part of it's cultural too, and but I'll let you get that.
Well, it's a reinforcement. Once it's part of the culture, it's taught down through generations, and there's no other way for that culture to operate, right? I mean, it becomes part of the scenery, if you like, part of the furniture of being in a culture like that, where racism or whatever else, other discrimination we're talking about today. Anyway.
Well, we've got a caller. Caller, you're on the air. What's your name?
Oh, hi, this is Charlie, you guys.
Charlie.
Hey, Charlie.
Great. Really enjoying it. I think Armistead Maupin is a very important writer because he really humanizes gay people, But I also wanted to call and say our family intermarried with a Mexican-American family about 25 years ago. And, engaging the people, they're like teachers and lawyers and stuff like that, very, very educated. And, I started to realize how pissed off I was that somebody would look at one of them and my relatives and judge them in a negative fashion. And then I had to look at my own assumptions about that. And, I went through a trip about it, though they kind of helped me guide it. First of all, they said, and I never really have felt this way, don't be a guilty white man, That doesn't help anybody. It doesn't put a job in anybody's house or any food on their table. And watch out for getting what they call mau-mau'd, which means that somebody, especially in this case of a Latin culture, would try to make you feel like you didn't come from a culture. I'm Greek and Irish. And so I think that white guilt thing is, it's kind of an escape in a way of not really dealing with learning more about, people of color.
It's easier. It's kind of easier to have prejudice and to act on it than it is to learn about other people, maybe. Keeps
life simple, right?
Right.
Yeah, and also, another thing that I wanted to engage was, I'm a white male. I know that I was raised with a certain privilege that when I was growing up, the world that, say, people of color sent their kids off to school in was much different from the one I went to. But I'm sort of also counterculture. I'd probably have to, get a haircut and put on a suit and get some elevator shoes.
Are you a hippie?
Yeah, to try to really redeem my my privilege. But another thing I wanted to touch on was the chill that I felt when, I'm proud of the little business I run, but I'm always looking for something that's a little less physically taxing, at age 67. So I go to this online thing called Indeed Jobs Alert. And in that, you can look up a job and send your resume in, and online, never having any personal contact. But it occurred to me that when somebody looks at my birth year of 1948, without touching me at all or letting me have any personal contact, they could just hit the cancel button and say, this guy's too old.
Yeah. I think we probably have that as one of the pervasive ones, is believing someone's over the hill and cannot contribute as much as a young person.
Yeah, it really is something for the first time in my life that ever freaked me out,
So that makes it easy for would-be employers to discriminate against you, and thereby bypassing the equal employment opportunity laws, I guess, because they can just hit a button online and nobody knows why they're doing it.
Yeah, exactly. And so when I do, look around for other ways to make a living, I really try to insist on a personal contact.
Yeah. Did they ask what color you are, what your race is?
No, that hasn't come up. That's to come up more on official.
Could you have avoided your year of birth or your age? In other words, I don't know that applications are allowed to ask anymore, are they?
Oh, well, maybe not. Maybe I haven't been paying attention. I've had a pretty good job for a while now, so, I haven't been so hungry to, seek out other, ways of making money. But I have to admit that when you talk about prejudice, this potential of age prejudice visited upon me is really the thing that gave me probably the biggest chill of my recent life, and really made me feel like I could be victimized by that prejudice.
Right. Well, that's so real. I just recently had to send a resume to somebody, and I left off I usually have, when I got my bachelor's degree, the year I graduated, things like that. So I've removed things like that. I just have, bachelor's degree, and then I have for work experience prior to 1990, I just put, primarily have worked in this or that arena. So,
yeah.
What is that sound outside? Oh.
Yeah, well, I'm glad, you guys are so aware of that, and I appreciate it. I'll get off now in case somebody wants to call, but thanks a lot. It's been great talking to you, and I'm
Thank you, Charlie.
Still out here working and still listening.
We really appreciate your calls, Charlie.
Thanks, Charlie. We think you're young as can be.
Okay. I try to stay that way. Thank you very much.
Excellent.
So, this is, we're talking about discrimination, Prejudice in Action. If you're hearing sound in the background, that is some renovations that are happening in the office out here. Well, so let me just, here's the Equal Opportunity Commission discrimination list in alphabetical order. Age, disability, equal pay compensation. Genetic information. Employers are no longer allowed to ask any genetic information. If they get genetic information from any source, they are not allowed to act on it somehow. Wow. And you're not required to give genetic information. National origin, pregnancy, race and color, religion, sex, and sexual harassment. Those are the types of discrimination that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission acts upon.
I remember on the age, it used to say you can't discriminate at someone 55 or older. It was really aimed at the old, but you could discriminate maybe between a 20-year-old and a 30-year-old. So at least that's how it used to be. I don't know if that's changed, but that was clearly only if you were in that group of 55 or older could you bring a case that you were discriminating against.
Well, it's interesting because Andy, my husband, is in the tech world and has been. He was in tech and computers back when there weren't laptops and there were, so he's been in that industry for many, many years. And it's always been considered a young person's industry. But so he's working on a presentation he'll be doing at a conference in May to all these tech guys that do tech asset management and that kind of thing about how much it's costing businesses when they don't hold on to their older employees because of the institutional memory that they have. So, and that an employee, something like if you hire someone who's 55 or older, they on average will stay with you for 7 years. If you hire someone 25 to 50, they will stay with you on average 3.5 years.
Really?
So, first of all, older people tend to stay, and that every time you have turnover, you're losing institutional memory, and it weakens and that experience, and knowing like, oh no, don't do that changeover on the server for this because we did that 7 years ago and it crashed. So that was just interesting to me that he's going to be giving a talk to
retention of history, of historic.
How important that is,
I relate to that. In the IT industry, I served and was a computer programmer, designer, analyst, tester, manager, director, all of those jobs, and then saw how there was this .com boom, and it was a bubble ultimately that really valued, we got to have totally new ideas. We got to push all of you people aside who've been in the technology, the IT department, because there's this whole new wave. And it was pretty much assumed that unless you were 20-something, you weren't hip enough to be part of that. And all of the money seemed to go that direction. And it was, I felt age discrimination at that point and feeling like I wanted to participate in that wave, but I was out of hand, ruled out, because how could I possibly get it?
Well, to be frank, the reason Andy has his ponytail is about 10 years ago, I told him, I said, as the red was going away and the gray and white was coming in, and I said, you've got to shave off the white beard and you need a ponytail. But you should dress really preppy so you just confuse them and they won't know. So Andy thinks it's hilarious. Every time he brings on a new hire, they'll say stuff like, do you have a motorcycle? Are you in a rock band? They'll ask him the craziest questions, so they assume, what does an old guy with a ponytail like? So it gives him this sort of mystery, but I haven't been able to talk him into a man bun yet.
Oh, please don't do that.
I like the ponytail. I'm not sure I like the bun idea.
So, as a woman, a white woman, have you felt that you've been discriminated against in the workforce, or? Yes,
and I think I'll be giving my age away, but I think most everybody out here knows that I'm pushing 60. So I was in the radio business for a long time. I had a career in radio for over 30 years, and I started in radio in 1976, and it was a very male business, and the only jobs women held were the job I held, which was I was a copywriter, so I wrote copy and made commercials for the station, or secretary or receptionist. But all the sales jobs and management jobs and engineering jobs were men, and there were a few female DJs, and that was about it. And I was very fortunate. This was in Birmingham, Alabama, that I had a very forward-thinking boss that he decided he started to hire women in sales, which there'd never been a woman salesperson, radio salesperson in the market, or even in the Atlanta market. So because he said women are great in sales, and it started to change the whole kind of way sales were done, because you have the traditional pushy salesperson, which is a kind of a masculine trait of being very yang. And so he said women were great because they did their paperwork, they listened, they figured out how to build a relationship so they didn't lose clients the way men did. So we ended up with an almost all-female sales force. And over time, he asked me, because I would go meet with the clients to help them write their radio commercials and all. And one of our reps was leaving, and her client said, why can't we just deal with Robin? And I said, oh, I don't want to be in sales because, I'm a creative person. I want to be a copywriter. And he told me how much the salespeople made. And I said, I want to be in sales now. So I became a salesperson. And then so I didn't have any prejudice within that, but I did with certain clients that I called on, like car dealers. And so I would get sometimes sexually harassed. But, that was an issue. But the bigger issue was when he promoted me to national sales manager for the station. So I was the first female national sales manager that we knew of in the country. And that was that was 1978 or 9. And I went to New York. You would have rep firms in the big cities like in New York and Chicago that represented your radio station to the big ad agencies. So I went to New York to meet with our rep firm, introduced myself and talked to them about what I thought was important, blah, blah, blah. And they were all men except for their secretaries. It was all men, and they were very condescending to me. I think, A, because I was a young woman, I was 25, and B, I had my Southern accent. And they treated me in a very condescending, like over-the-top condescending. They thought they were being so nice.
You come to the boys' club.
And I bet they were condescending to the secretaries there as well. I mean,
if they weren't sleeping with them.
Well,
I mean, they were,
exactly.
It was very Mad Men.
Yeah.
It was still, even in the 70s, it was still very much that Mad Men culture.
And so you were breaking a glass ceiling there when you walked into that room, right?
Well, yes, and I knew that I didn't know. I was so upset that they weren't taking me seriously. So I got on the phone and called the head of the station, which was interesting. My station was owned by a Southern company out of Texas, and that our chain of radio stations were so progressive about women. So I called Pete and I said, "This is not going well at all. I was really, this happened and that happened, and I said I'm so mad, and I don't want to have like a temper tantrum on them." And he said, "Okay, I'll call you right back." So he called me back and he says, "All right." We were with Eastman Radio, which was one of the big rep firms everybody liked, and they were very old school rep firm. And he said, "You have an appointment with Katz Radio tomorrow morning, and I want you to call Eastman and say cancel all my calls with you. I'm getting pitched by Katz Radio tomorrow, and tell him that Pete's flying in too because he's thinking of changing the whole chain over, which would have been our Houston station, our Tampa station. Anyway, so long story short, that was my experience of having to go ahead and break through that glass ceiling and exert." That you can't treat me like this.
But it was a good experience.
But I was backed up by my company, thank God.
That's great. And so what's the climate now? Do you know? I mean, what's the makeup of the
By the time I moved to San Francisco in the 80s, I would say half of the salespeople were women. It was still management was male. It was actually a little more throwback here than there. But I would say that radio was a great breaking ground for women
so
in
there's
management.
that institutionalized sort of just acceptance of discrimination, of prejudice, which becomes discriminatory when you're not allowed to become a part of the boys' club.
Exactly.
And it's usually, well, so I'm sort of thinking about the extremes of discrimination as well. Like, I mean, let's talk about the Nazis, that whole thing where Eichmann at the end, when he was caught in South America and was whisked back to Jerusalem, and they tried him in 1961. And Hannah Arendt wrote about him and talked about the banality of evil, because this was just a guy who was not had no ideas of his own. He just went along. He was following orders, following the law, following the culture that he was in. And he did he put in place this incredibly hideous, evil thing. And yet he was this sort of pasty little gray man. It's the gray men who do all the big damage, the evil and the violence in the world, because they're going along, right?
Well, they derived power from this corrupt system, of course, but that had all the military behind it. So, I mean, it was either you go along or you die. I mean, I'm not defending it. I just say that these systems that grow up, these fascist or other kinds of centrally controlled systems with the military behind them, quite a difficult spot puts people.
I mean, I can see in another generation or two looking back in horror at us, at the fact that our military is spread all over the world, murdering people constantly. You know, we're in this constant state of warfare everywhere, and that we're not in the streets going bananas over it. You know, I think that as well as climate change and other things, but the thing about what we are allowing our government to do in the rest of the world, you know, we're seen as a pretty evil culture by a lot of other people in the rest of the world.
And the majority of Americans are wonderful people who are just nice folks, and they're, you know, but we're going along with that culture because it's. And once it gets that big, how can you fight? How can you be one person and fight it?
And we're beneficiaries of the spoils of that.
Sure.
You know, when the British Empire was taking resources and taking advantage of indigenous labor and slave labor, et cetera, bringing it home to Great Britain, pretty much everybody on that island benefited from that process. So it's really hard to, you know, bite the hand that feeds you. And I think that's what's going on in the United States too. Sure. Is we are an imperialist power, just like the British were. Maybe not so obvious to most people, but that colonialism of taking resources, whether it be oil or trees or soil or whatever it is we're taking, and the expansion, that's all massive discrimination. And we hear Donald Trump unabashedly saying, let's stop Muslims from coming into our country. I mean, that's an example of how brazen we are.
I know. And who'd have thought there would be a presidential candidate saying that stuff?
And leading their party.
Who would have even believed 8-10 years ago that we could have the level of puerile, disgusting discourse that we're having? I mean, even hearing like Jeb Bush answer, when you're hearing them debate now, some of the things they say are really, as I think one linguist said, they're speaking at the level of fourth grade boys. And that's a horrifying idea
but
that's
they
who
get
rose to
results
power.
With that. That's the problem. It's like negative ads work. That's why we can't seem to get rid of them, and they get more vicious as the competition gets more fierce. And the problem is we, the consumer, the voter in general, are responding to that nonsense.
Yeah. So what are the cures that have been tried? So we have political correctness is sort of the backlash to discrimination, right? I mean,
and does that help? Because it seems one of the things that why people love Donald Trump is because people have felt like, oh my God, I can't say anything without messing it up. So then you've got this guy just spewing out whatever random thing goes whizzing through his head, and people were sort of, their inner child is delighting it, like, I want to be able to say whatever I want to say. Right. Is that part of the backlash with Trump, you think?
I don't want to talk about Trump right now. I want to take it to my experience in corporate America. I was with Pac Bell in management, and I was there during the time where it changed. You know, when I started, the men came into the management positions, the women came into being operators and clerical people, et cetera. And there's a huge differentiation between your gender and what job you could get, and et cetera. Then that started to change. We brought women into management, and we changed. And then the language got. And so what is political correctness was also corporate policy. And part of it was to put an end to the kind of male jokes that would put women down, or the kind of white jokes that would put minorities down. And people say, well, I'm just joking. Well, those jokes hurt. And the people at the receiving end of that ridicule know it hurts. Yet the establishment within that company felt like, what harm does it do? But it kept the power. It kept the power structure in place for a long time, and it really required law and lawsuits and what we could call political correctness. And I very much favored it. I mean, I would even correct people a lot because I learned from my daughter who, when I called her a girl and she was in college, she said, girls are in high school, we're women in college. And so she educated me, and people would say, give that to the girls, meaning to the staff to copy and distribute. And I said, I think they're over age 18. I would tell my colleagues this all the time because I believed in that. I had a daughter. I wanted it. But it was a transition that we went through in that corporation. I think most corporations. So I think the political correctness is right, even though it's derided right now, maybe because it's gone too far.
It's a necessary step in the right direction.
Yeah, because if we don't change the language, we're not going to change our thinking either.
Right. And then there's what white people like to call reverse discrimination.
Oh, yeah.
Where
I couldn't get into college because they had a quota for all those minorities, and I'm an unfortunate majority where only 80% of us get in. And
yeah, there was that Supreme Court ruling, 2009, not so long ago, where they
overturned
upheld
quota, right?
Yeah. They upheld a suit against the fire department. Where was it? Fire department in New Haven, Connecticut. 19 white firefighters and one Hispanic firefighter sued the city for not hiring them when they'd passed the test. And the city said, well, because no people of color passed the test, obviously the test was faulty, so we're not going to allow anyone to be promoted to these positions.
Wow.
And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, these guys are right. That's reverse discrimination. It's wrong, right? So fine lines.
That's kind of an extreme example, that to have that happen where they just throw the whole test out and all these people tested.
Right.
But you would think that it would also make you think, what is there something wrong with the test? Is it culturally biased?
Right. Yeah, well, exactly. So one of the dissenting judges, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, said because 60% of it was in writing, why is that appropriate in the first place? To have a written test for a firefighter, that it was sort of discrimination. And the city was acting under what it thought was Title VII of the Anti-Discrimination Act of not since those results happened that they could be accused under Title VII of being discriminating.
We've got a caller. Caller, you're on the air. What's your name?
Oh, this is Charlie again.
Hi, Charlie.
Hey, Charlie.
I just wanted to lean in. Everything you're saying sounds really cool. And, in the carpentry business, I've run into lots of different kinds of guys. There are guys that would do anything for you on the job. They would help you, they would go way out of their way. But every once in a while, they'd say something weird about, a Mexican or a woman.
Yep.
And I started to get my dander up, and I was going to start, being the big polemicist and give them a lecture. And then I thought, you know what? These people are not throwaways. They just say funny things, and they have weird attitudes from God knows where. And so one guy I took aside and I said, I have a woman who's like a Mexican person who's, my sister-in-law. So I would appreciate it if you wouldn't talk like that around me.
Good for you.
And I think that, it also happened when my son graduated from Long Beach State, and some of his friends were a little miffed because the Black and the Latin students had their own separate graduation ceremony, separate from the main one.
Wow.
Wow.
And the white kids were saying, well, how come they get another, blah, blah, blah. And, and I tried to breathe and sit them down, because they're not bad kids. They're really great guys, Yeah. And I said, look, and there was a young woman there who was saying the same thing, and I said, some of these people never, ever in their families would ever think that they'd have a college diploma, ever in a million years. And I know it's difficult to realize that, but I guess the point I just want to put out to the listeners is that if there's a way that you can work with somebody, and not throw away all their goodness, because they say something stupid, I would just encourage people to try to do that,
Boy, that's such an important point, Charlie. I'm so glad you called in to express it.
I'll hang up now. I'm sorry.
Oh, thanks, Charlie. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
That is a great point because, especially myself coming from a culture where, especially among white people, there's still, and older white people, there are still prejudicial things or jokes or little remarks that they will make. And these are people that I know, and I'll say, don't say that around me or whatever. But, I've had friends react in ways, or how can you even stay connected with them, or how can you even be, on my Facebook page, I have a policy, since I've got all my relatives from back home and stuff on, is if anybody posts anything that I think is offensive, I don't unfriend them. I just delete the post,
Right.
And if they're posting political stuff on my timeline that I find offensive, I just delete it. And I every now and then just put out on Facebook, there are going to be things that some of you say that offend me, and I'm not going to unfriend you, but I will delete it. So, that's my policy. But if you want to know why I deleted something to have a conversation, just private message me and I'll tell you why. And if you don't want to know, then let's just don't post, I mean, I think Charlie's right. You don't want to throw people away. And coming from a culture that there's, more open prejudice than you see around here. I mean, I see plenty of prejudice around here. That people that are pretending in our community to be such great supporters of the Latino community. And then I hear them say things or hear them do things. It's like, I don't think they're getting it. And so, I think that we do have to understand that sometimes people, like Charlie's kids, didn't come, they don't understand the backstory, or they're older and they just have patterns that they haven't broken.
I was an only child, and my parents never really talked to me about any of this, but I had a very simple view of life. And I went to the YMCA and then just locker talk as a young boy. It shocked me because it was so anti-gay, anti-women, anti-everything. And it was a way I could see how culture amongst boys is formed in these places that are outside of the scrutiny of people saying, you can't say that or you shouldn't say that. And to stand up as a boy, I wouldn't stand up then. Now I would, as an old man, if I'm in that locker room and I hear that, but I'm not in the locker room.
Yeah, again, it's men. It's, very often men going along, right? I mean, they're going along with the prevailing culture.
Peer pressure,
not questioning it because, you're following the laws of your own little niche in a culture. And if you want to get along, you have to go along, right? I mean, it's like Milgram's experiment, the one where he had people shocking someone in the next room. Right? They'd ask him a question. If they got it wrong, he gave them a shock, and it would increase the shock every time they got a question wrong. And most of the people, 80% of the people, went all the way to 450 volts. They thought
because they were following the orders.
They weren't giving shocks, but they thought they were. So, people go along with what they're told.
Yeah.
They were able at any time to stop the experiment or go in the other room and see if he was okay or leave or do anything. But they didn't because there was an authority figure behind him in a lab coat.
And so when we indict police departments for how they institutionally treat minorities and stuff, it's really not unique to that profession. It just turns out in that profession, it's more deadly when
they happen to be armed.
But I say that those of us that think maybe that's not me, we should all look, because I think in all walks of life we can see what's going on now on the national stage. Like in Ferguson, there was no question that the police felt they were doing the right thing by enforcing the law and being more and more vigilant on blacks and on cars going too fast or whatever. But that systemic system created a problem for the poor black folks in that community who ultimately couldn't clear up their stuff at court. They'd go to jail. They'd have a felony. They can't get a job. I mean, we've got this systemic situation that most of us don't even understand and didn't understand, and we have had opportunities. And Black Lives Matter movement, I think, is huge. I am so pleased that they are, pushing the candidates to understand this a little more fully, because if you live in white Vermont or in white West Marin, I don't think we really understand what life is was like.
No,
Well,
we're coming. All three of us are coming from white privilege. You know,
Yeah.
I mean,
Exactly. And what drives me crazy is I have friends and relatives that'll post, like, well, white lives matter too. It's like, you idiot. It's like they were an enslaved population. Just look at the epigenetic damage we did to, kidnapping these people, enslaving them, and then treating them like,
to the present day.
To the present day.
As
And
second-rate human beings.
as not even human.
Right.
The fact that they can just be shot down for, walking down the street, that you can shoot them down. And I see a shift. To me, the South, that was always an issue with corrupt and the culture in police departments because it was left over from the KKK. But across the country, I see a shift in our police departments becoming more and more militaristic, that there has been a change.
Sure.
And that policemen used to be taught how to shoot an arm or a leg instead of killing people that are, running down the street with their hands in the air.
Yeah. Yep. So today, the Justice Department filed a civil rights suit against Ferguson, against the city. They've been trying for a year or so to get a deal going with the police department to reform it, and they're dragging their feet as much as they can in Ferguson because why would we reform it? So the Justice Department just filed suit today. So there you go. That's the latest from Ferguson, Missouri.
Well, it's interesting because when I lived in Richmond, across the bay, we got an amazing police chief Chris Magnus, and he came on board when I came on board for the Point Richmond Neighborhood Council. We were on a neighborhood council system, so each area had a representative. And Chris, his whole thing was he fired people and he started to change the culture right away. That they had to be on the streets. They had to get to know the people that they were policing.
Community
They had
policing.
to go community, and he turned that thing around so fast. I mean, it was amazing because the first thing he did was call together all the activist community that was trying to stop the shootings and the Tent City grandmas and all of that, and said, okay, so how can we help you and what do you see? And did some amazing things. They came up with a system of pointing out who's probably at risk and who's involved in the shootings, and then directly approaching them and kind of a controversial thing, but paying them to stay out of trouble. If you don't do anything, if you don't get arrested, if you don't get pulled over, if you don't shoot anybody, we'll give you, for every month you don't do that, we'll give you $300.
Wow.
I mean, he was trying whatever it took to shift, and he did do it. And the sad thing was he just got hired by, I think he's going either to Tucson or Phoenix, but
he's probably needed there.
Yeah.
So don't
he's
say
needed
sad
in
part.
San Francisco and San Jose are having real serious issues with their police departments, and they wouldn't go near him because I think they saw him as too radical, too progressive, and also Chief Magnus was gay, so it's very interesting to have a white gay man come into that community and he
could relate to the discrimination felt by a majority of that community.
Well, as you know, in the black communities, there's not as much acceptance of homosexuality.
Right.
So he came in with a lot, and Latinos as well. So so they were like, oh, now you bring us a gay guy?
Oh, they saw it as an
they're
offense.
like, you bring us a gay guy? So that's going to fix things. So it was fascinating to see what appeared to be something that was not going to work, how he brought everyone together. He did a beautiful job.
Treating people like human beings.
Exactly.
Right?
Well,
and trying to instill that as part of the culture instead of it just being one guy, but to get everybody to educate, just to get people to shift their minds a little bit.
Well, and you know what else, Paul? That whole thing, like we talked before about the alpha male, the beta male culture, is he really worked. Once you got rid of the bad actors, the bad apples, in an environment like that, as you were saying, Bernie, sort of the locker room masculine environment, if you're letting the alphas run amok, the betas are not going to say anything. So when you break that down and start to build up the men that are more sensitive and empathetic and say, that's what I value in a police officer, then those qualities get to rise to the top.
Yeah, I think in these communities throughout our country where we've seen this proliferation of police killings of minorities, that racism that's there is so deeply rooted, and it's very hard to challenge. I mean, yet we're now consciously as a society saying that must be challenged. And I'm so thankful that we have the video capture in our phones these days, because it's been going on for way too long, but we've been able to stay in denial as long as we weren't given the evidence. And today the evidence is everywhere of what's really going on. And so the police departments, the city council, like in Ferguson, who couldn't come to terms with the Justice Department, they're responding to a constituency, but they're still responding mostly to the constituency that's afraid of blacks. Right. They've got to view blacks as part of their constituency, especially when they're in large number. Well, regardless of a large number, but viewing the whole breadth of people. But we've got a class structure in our society, and it has privileged us and us whites and us males, and that's why we sort of want to hang on to it, but we know that it doesn't make sense.
Right. Yeah, so, well, it's encouraging, I think. I mean, having had a black president for 8 years, just having that as a figurehead, whatever he may or may not have done, but that just having that picture.
Are you saying we need a woman now?
I always think we need a woman. I'm not sure.
The right woman, though.
Yes, I didn't actually live through it, but having seen what Maggie did to Britain, you know.
The Iron Lady.
Just because she's a woman. No. Women, of course. Women also discriminated against from time immemorial, ever since, I don't know, we started agriculture. And, of course, they have a right. And, of course, it would be wonderful to have the feminine sensibility in the top job. You know, but you have to see the record. You have to, you still have to go by what you think is going to be accomplished.
Our military has degenderified now and saying women in all aspects of the Department of Defense can go in any role. So that's a good thing. And I think we do need a woman commander-in-chief, but I don't want a woman who's just going to be another patriarch as a female in that role. I really would like to see someone who comes from a different point of view. The question, are we actually doing more good or harm with this Department of Defense? And should we consider a whole nother way of dealing with other countries that is much more the feminine way of trying to negotiate and cooperate rather than pull out your guns and blow them away?
Well, I think a lot of the earlier feminists, and a lot of women that got into power early on and broke glass ceilings, they did it by playing the game in a male way.
Yes.
And by playing the game within the patriarchal
system. They felt they
system.
had to have any chance.
Or they adopted those behaviors, sort of, I call it the Athena thing. I wasn't born of woman. I leapt out of Zeus's head, so I'm just like you guys, And I think that, that's one of the issues, too, that young women are not relating to, say, Hillary Clinton because they don't, first of all, they haven't had the level of discrimination. And second of all, they're really worried about, young people are worried because they're in debt and there doesn't seem to be a very bright future for them and they don't have health care. And I have to tell you, Obamacare doesn't do a whole lot. My son's paying $300 or $400 a month and all he's getting is major medical. He'd rather have the $300 or $400 a month and be able to go to the clinic when he needs to. So, they're not seeing, the young people aren't seeing Obamacare as this great big saving thing for them either. It's just now he and his wife have to pay for that too, and they're still not getting good medical care. So they'd like to see, socialized medicine. So I think that's interesting. But when you said about Obama being this symbol, which I think for so many of us, it was like an unbelievable moment that we finally had a black president and that we even had one. But I also think it caused racial backlash in the angry white men that are racist because it was like, how dare a black dude be president when I'm stuck in my terrible job and, being reverse discriminated against all the time.
Well, yeah, and, lower class, the class system includes whites and blacks, and the lower class whites are discriminated against as much as maybe a little bit less than.
I don't know.
The Supreme Court just recently took away that aspect of the Civil Rights Voting Act, the Voting Rights Act, Title V or whatever it was, that said that these particular states who had shown a pattern of voter discrimination have to pre-clear, and And then the Supreme Court actually decided that, no, we got a black president now. We got all of these laws in place. Things are quite equal, so we don't need that anymore. So they furthered the idea of keeping the status quo rather than continuing this fight because they believe it's not as bad.
We have a black president, so everything's okay.
Exactly. So it gave a false sense of that we've arrived.
Yeah, right.
Oh, we've got a caller. Caller, you're on the air. What's your name?
Hi, my name is Shelley Rugg.
Hi, Shelley.
Hi. I'm a little nervous, so.
Well, what got your attention?
Well, the topic, and I had an experience recently. Visited an uncle of mine, and I love my uncle deeply. And during the visit, he confided in me. He and his wife, very quietly, they let me know they were on the Trump train. And the thing that struck me was that, well, first of all, I didn't understand it because my uncle wouldn't like Trump. It didn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
So I asked, what is it about Trump that you like? Why do you like Trump? So I think at the core of it is, of course, a big misunderstanding about racism and what it means. And so what has happened for someone like my uncle, they feel like they have to closet themselves, that they aren't allowed to speak freely about their viewpoints. And I don't think that they see it is because they're racist. I think they just, that's how I see the world. And also another huge factor is the fear issue. And Trump is really good at stirring up the idea that if we're afraid of something, then we just need to get rid of it. We need to obliterate it. We bomb it, we put up a wall, we kick it out.
Simple solutions.
That's the basis of most prejudice, I guess, is the fear of the other, right?
Right, the unknown, the unknown factors, and better safe than sorry is the motto that came through my head,
Yeah.
I don't care. I'm going to be racist if that's what it takes to keep me and my family safe in America, then so be it.
Well, Shelley, thank you so much for sharing that and that you're keeping your heart open and listening to your aunt and uncle. And I know having relatives that are on the train as well, that it can be scary and challenging to know that.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for calling in.
Shelley.
Okay.
And we did get a tweet from Murray. While there's plenty of prejudice, the trend seems good. I see less prejudice than when I was growing up in Cleveland, Murray says. There you go.
Great note to end on.
So I want to thank all our listeners and our callers today for calling in and listening in. Tune in every Thursday at 11 because your voice really does matter.